Да, дорогие коллеги, приветствую вас на очередном заседании нашего семинара. И сегодня наш докладчик – это наш коллега и друг из Свободного университета Амстердама Алан Ченки. Алан известен как крупный специалист в области жестов, мультимодальной или мультиканальной коммуникации, автор множества работ, монографий, статей. И сегодня Алан представит нам доклад Speakers, Gestures and Semantic Analysis. Доклад будет подписан по-английски, но Алан прекрасно владеет русским языком, поэтому я думаю, что если будут вопросы после доклада по-русски, то это тоже возможно, поэтому, значит, не стесняйтесь, если вам так будет проще, то я думаю, Алан будет не против ответить на вопросы, или, по крайней мере, выслушать вопросы на русском языке. Напоминаю коротко наш регламент, примерно, не очень он жесткий, но примерно до 70 минут, собственно, сам доклад, и после этого у нас будет оставшееся время на вопросы. Предоставляю слово Алану.
Хорошо, большое спасибо. Спасибо за приглашение. Я очень рад иметь возможность быть с вами виртуально сегодня. И доклад буду читать на английском языке. К сожалению, не успел все приготовить на русском языке, но, как уже было сказано, если будут вопросы в конце на русском, это тоже возможно задавать такие вопросы. Таким образом. Хорошо, так что я перейду на презентацию. Момент. Так. So I'll switch over to English now. And speaking about speakers, gestures, and semantic analysis. And basically what I want to do is present some arguments in favor of thinking about or raising the question about looking at gestures in connection with study of semantics. And after making some points about why that might make sense to do, I then like to raise some questions and actually perhaps raise more questions than there are answers for at this time. But I think it's worth raising these questions to think about how the field of study can develop in the future and new directions for future research. So I'll turn to a little example to begin with, which is if someone says, I want that one, and they don't do anything, they don't move at all in any way, which is difficult to do actually, we don't know probably which one they're talking about of whatever it is, whatever kinds of items they're referring to. So this is a classic case where we would need a pointing gesture, probably some kind of deictic indication to make sense out of the speech that's going along with the gesture. So this is a well-known phenomenon. And actually, though, when we look at the gesture, we see that it can provide more information than the speech can in the sense of the direction of the item that's being referred to. Maybe something about how close or how far away it is, even depending on how the pointing is done. So the gesture already we see a simple act of pointing can provide us additional information that we might want to call semantic information with that utterance that's being produced. In addition, there are other gestures that McNeil has called speech-linked gestures that can indicate other factors that often go with deictic kinds of words. So when someone says this kind or like this, so this and that kind of expressions, gestures can indicate the size or the shape of the referent. So if they're talking about something and they're showing it with their gestures and they say, I want to buy a loaf of bread that's this big, then you're going to have a sense of it from the gesture, which you wouldn't have just from the words alone. So we have these categories of speech-linked gestures, and in that sense, pointing is also probably a kind of speech-linked gesture, can be used without speech, but is often necessary to complete an utterance. So if we move beyond that and say, what can the study of speakers' gestures contribute to semantic analysis of spoken language. In particular, I'm starting from the position in cognitive linguistics, looking at how what speakers, how people use language, looking at what that can reveal about underlying cognitive processes in some way. And in that sense, semantics is looked at in cognitive linguistics in terms of conceptual structures and conceptual processes and forms of expression, be they words or I'll also argue gestures, provide cues for constructing meaning. So for how the listener or the person who's attending to, paying attention to the speaker will then be able to construct some kind of meaning, and hopefully that meaning that the listener constructs will be in some way comparable to the meaning that the speaker had in mind when they were speaking. This idea of cues for constructing meaning, I think, is really important and interesting way to think of how language works, because as opposed to a, let's say, a folk model of language as containing meaning that gets transferred from one person to another, this is what Michael Reddy had argued in 1979 in his in the book on metaphor and thought, that this is a kind of folk model that we have about how language works, but it's very difficult to get outside of thinking about language that way, because it's that way of talking about language is so embedded in our language about language. So when we talk about texts and meaning, we so often in English and Russian and many other languages refer to the meaning as being in the text somehow, and that you have to get the meaning out of the text. So it's difficult, as Michael Reddy pointed out in his paper, it's difficult to turn our thinking around and say, okay, how can we use a construction metaphor to think about how language works, where language is a kind of tool that we use, and we share that tool with other people in our culture to try to express certain kinds of ideas and construct certain kinds of meaning. This view where we think more broadly about what are those cues, what constitute these cues for constructing meaning in communicative settings, is something that Alexander Bergs pointed out was raised earlier, but many are often not aware of this. And he went back in his example to Leonard Bloomfield in 1933, and quoting him saying, the stimulus which calls forth speech, the stimulus, the idea, leads also to some other reaction. Still other responses are visible. They do, along with speech, serve as stimuli to the hearer. These actions are facial expressions, mimicry, tone of voice, and above all, gesture. So back already in the 1930s, Bloomfield was suggesting that it's not only language that is providing cues for the listener or the reader, if it's a written text, but there are other things going on. In a face-to-face interaction, if you're a person who can see and can hear, then you're probably going to be able to pick up on these other kinds of cues. So if we take the question, what can the use of gesture reveal about a number of different aspects related to semantics? And today I'll look at mental simulation of entities and events. What can it reveal about the conceptualization of spatial imagery? So if we think about gesture, it's an inherently spatial medium. We're using spatial forms to express ideas, not only sound waves like with speech. And what can it reveal about the objectification of abstract concepts? So not only referring to physical things in the world, but how can gesture even provide insights into how we're thinking about different abstract domains? So let's start with the first point, thinking about mental simulation. And in a summary of some of the research on mental simulation in this big handbook on body language and communication from 2013 and 14, Margetis and Bergen describe mental simulation as follows. They say, meaning is embodied internally when we create embodied simulations, co-opting brain areas specialized for perception or action to create dynamic mental representations, rich in sensory motor detail. So what they're saying is that when we think about something, to some degree, we are activating perhaps visual information and maybe even motoric information, how we might move in relation to the acts that we're talking about. And these then also actually start to innervate, to activate the nerves that are involved in, for example, motoric activity. And one of the arguments that's been made by Hostetter and Alibali, working at University of Wisconsin, is that there is a kind of threshold that we have where if this information, this motoric and visual information is activated sufficiently, then that might produce gestures. When there is some kind of oppression or suppression of that, like if someone is in a formal situation and they're controlling their behavior more than they might normally, then those gestures might also not be, might not appear, might be suppressed as well. So there's a kind of variable moving threshold. But they make this connection between the idea of mental simulation and gesture use, which I think is an interesting idea. And if we follow up on that, it's consistent with the thinking in cognitive linguistics that then what we're doing when we're speaking might reveal something about the ideas that we're expressing. And we can think of that as relating to semantics. So if we go back to this idea of mental simulation, I'd like to take an example from a project that's been going on at Moscow State Linguistic University. This is from the first phase of that project, which involved simultaneous interpreters working in a booth. And the interpreters were recorded from 3 different viewpoints. So one viewpoint is from a small camera placed in front of them, a GoPro camera, looking up at the interpreter. Here you see that camera actually in this view. The other camera, which you see here, is a Sony camera on a tripod looking over the shoulder of the interpreter, and that's the view we see on the bottom left here. But you also notice the interpreters wearing these kind of glasses, and these are eye tracking glasses with eye trackers in them. So they're then, we see with the cameras that are in the glasses as well, the view that the interpreter sees looking out the door, looking at the window of the booth. Here they're just looking into an empty classroom in front of them. But we see as they're talking, the focus of the visual attention moving around to a little red dot that's moving around on the screen. So these 3 cameras provide us with, especially these 2 cameras on the top and on the left, provide us with good ways, good viewpoints on the gestures that the speakers are using, both in terms of the depth and space and also in terms of the vertical dimension. So in this case, the interpreters, their task is to interpret a 10-minute excerpt from a lecture. In this case, the lecture was in English and they're interpreting into Russian. And the lecture is about evolution and species dying out over time, climate change, these kind of issues. And in this case, in the example that we'll see, the speaker, which is from a TED talk actually online, is talking about a dinosaur and how you could calculate the force of the bite of a dinosaur. It's sort of a side issue having to do with the, not directly with the main topic. I should mention that the interpretation is happening just through hearing the speaker. So the interpreters are not seeing a video of the speaker. So the recording on the bottom next to the speaker, you can see a laptop sitting there open. The laptop has an audio recording of the lecture, and the interpreter only hears through the headphones the voice of the speaker. So in this sense, they're not influenced in any way by the gestures that the speaker made. We did that on purpose in order to see what role gesture might play for the interpreters in formulating their thoughts as they're doing their job under this great cognitive load that the simultaneous interpreters have in doing their work. So let's see what happens here. Here's the excerpt. This is what the interpreter says when interpreting this clip, and in this case, thinking about the bite of the T-Rex. And here we see that the speaker was talking about how they can model the dinosaur and actually the force that the dinosaur was using in biting on something. So here, let's see what the interpreter does as he's saying this.
Каким образом вы рассчитываете силу укуса T-Рекса? Это сканирование черепа и создание трехмерной модели в компьютере, естественно, которая затем разделяется на целый набор различных элементов.
So let's take a look at that once again. And what I think is also interesting is that there's no one listening live in the moment to the interpreter. There's not an audience that the interpreter is interpreting to. Granted, they're being recorded, but it's not gesture being used in a communicative context where the person can see the interpreter and they might pick up information from them. So this raises also interesting questions about the role of gesture for the speaker, in this case, for the interpreter. Let's look at that once again and see what you see here, and then we'll break it down into different parts.
И каким образом вы рассчитываете силу укуса тирекса? Это сканирование черепа и создание трехмерной модели в компьютере, естественно, которая затем разделяется на целый набор различных элементов.
So there's a lot going on here. So let's break it down into two different parts. When he was talking about the sila ukusa, so this force of the bite by the T-Rex, the dinosaur, we see the two hands of the speaker then coming together, fingers slightly spread apart. And if you've seen a skeleton of this dinosaur, the T-Rex, then you know it has these big teeth as well and this big jaw. So in this sense, knowing something about the referent that's being talked about here, we can infer that likely, this form of the gesture might have something to do with the form of the referent, talking about the dinosaur jaws biting down. Cornelia Müller, in a number of her works, has talked about different modes of representation that are used in gesture. Here I'll look at them as different facets of representation, not as distinct modes, completely separate from each other, but they're different facets of how representation works, and they might in fact overlap with each other in some ways. So in some cases, like in this case, I would argue that the hands are then embodying the teeth and the jaws of the dinosaur that's being talked about, moving together towards each other. So in that sense, the hands can become something else. Later, the interpreter talks about making a model of this through some kind of computational methods, making a three-dimensional model of the jaws of the dinosaur. And as he's talking about that, his two hands are then facing each other and more stationary with the fingers spread apart. And in this sense, if we take the fact that the hands are open, the palms facing each other, this is a way in which someone might hold something between their hands. And so in this case, we might see what Müller calls holding or molding a form in the gesture. Later, he then talks about dividing up the different parts of this computational model in order to analyze what was going on and analyze the force of the dinosaur biting down. And in that sense, the hands move apart, which can also be a way of taking something and dividing it into two. And here we see what Müller calls the acting mode, doing something that you might normally do with objects, but then in this case, you're not holding anything actually, and just talking about that. So these different modes that are used to represent aspects of the reference raise some interesting points and interesting questions about how representation works, that it works in different ways. But we also see the different kinds of information that we can get if we see the gestures that we can get from them in terms of the visualization of the ideas that the speaker has. And in that sense, perhaps also the way the speaker is mentally simulating this topic that they're talking about, and in this case, interpreting. If we take another example, here's another interpreter who's working on a similar lecture. This is in German in this case, but it's about the same topic, about the species dying out and numbers of species reducing and things like that. And so in this case, the speaker who was speaking in German in the original lecture says that we can see these losses of the different amounts of the species, and they're shown on a graph. And he says here, in his interpretation. So let's see what the interpreter does as he's saying that here.
Вы видите то, что данные потери, они обозначены красным на схеме.
So very quick, but if you look at that again, and if you looked at the left side before and now look at the right side, or vice versa, if you looked at the right side before and now look at the left side, you see different things. Here it is again.
Вы видите то, что данные потери, они обозначены красным на схеме.
So we see a couple of things that the speaker does. One is that, and these words that are in kind of yellow here, he's pointing up to the right. If you looked at this side, on the left side, you also might have seen his eyes going up to the right as well while he did that. So this is an interesting situation because there's nothing there. So there's no graph that the interpreter is looking at. The interpreter's in the booth, there's an empty classroom in front of him. But in some way, it seems like he's mentally simulating not only the contents of what's being talked about, but even what the speaker might have done. So picturing what someone would do in this context, when you talk about something being indicated on a graph, you might then be pointing to the graph for the audience to see that. So this then gets a little more complicated because we see this mental simulation might not only have to do with the referent, what's being talked about, but might have to do even with the context and the situation, or in this case of unusual speech that the interpreter has to do, speaking for someone else. There might even be simulation of the speaker, him or herself. So this idea of viewpoint comes into play. And this is another important concept in cognitive linguistics that's being researched more and more, how we see that the meaning of what's being expressed is not neutral reference out there in the world, but we're always taking a perspective on them. We're always showing some viewpoint about what we're thinking about through the words that we choose, and in this case, through the gestures and the way they're produced. So this takes us to the notion of construal. So if we think about meaning in the context of cognitive linguistics, Ron Lanneker's work in cognitive grammar, which he's published in a number of books, he draws on this notion of construal, which is an unusual word in English. It's not used very often, but in cognitive linguistics, it's used a lot because of this concept that's connected to it. So what Lanneker says, it's our ability to conceive or conceive of and portray the same situation in alternate ways. So that when we're talking about something, we can talk about that same referent from different perspectives. And what Lanneker says is that linguistic meaning involves then both conceptual content, so referring to certain ideas, reference, and the construal imposed on that content. So we see a kind of layering of aspects of meaning here, that the meaning, the semantics has to do in cognitive linguistics, not only with what we're talking about, but how we're thinking about what we're talking about. So let's take that a little further. What Lanneker says construal involves is, on the one hand, levels of specificity. How specifically are we talking about the thing that we're talking about? The degree of focusing, whether we put the reference into the foreground or the background, prominence of the referent, whatever the topic is, are we emphasizing it or not? The perspective, so here we get this idea of viewing arrangement, which then might have more to do with a subjective viewpoint that the speaker has, or taking a more objective point of view and trying to think of things out there on the world, how others might see them. And if we take these aspects of construal, we can already see how that can relate to gesture use as well. As we've already seen, the perspective taking that the speaker displays in their use of gesture going with what they're talking about. So this idea of mental simulation that we started with has been picked up by several scholars to then talk about simulation semantics, to say that a way to think about semantics within cognitive linguistics that would be coherent with other theoretical ideas in cognitive linguistics is to say that if semantics is based in mental simulation, then we can see how those, for example, aspects of construal come into play in how speakers are expressing their ideas. Let's turn to another feature of this, another topic, which is spatial imagery. So as I mentioned, gestures are inherently spatial in form. So it seems like if we're talking about things in space, which we're doing all the time, talking about locations and movements and actions, that gesture should be relevant here in some way. So I'd like to look at some research that's been done with this, this book, this kind of children's book for storytelling called Frog, Where Are You? Which has been used for several decades now, where it's a kind of adventure story only in pictures where there's no text. And a number of different things happen. So like here we see there's a little boy that's been walking with the dog. But at one point something happens and there are a bunch of bees that are flying and chasing the dog, and there's an owl coming out of the hole in the tree. So there's a lot of action happening here. And the focusing on the owl for a moment, what scholars have looked at, what linguists have looked at is different ways in which these motion events, like the owl coming out of the tree or flying down to the ground, can be expressed in different languages. So like in English, we can say the bird flew down from out of the hole in the tree. But in a language like Spanish, the information gets packaged in a different way. So here we have el pájaro salió del agujero del árbol volando hacia abajo. Then we see something different going on here. Here's a gloss in English of the Spanish, but we see that the manner that's part of the verb in English, how did the bird move? It flew, is then expressed through a participle in Spanish then, by flying, let's say. Whereas the path of the motion, so in English we have a prepositional phrase out of the hole in the tree, is then expressed in the verb in Spanish. So kind of like exiting in English. So English has those options to also use this way of expressing the event with some kinds of motion. So this differential way of spreading the information in different languages is found to be actually a typological difference in how different languages express spatial events. And what Dan Slobin and Len Telmy and others have talked about is how some languages are what they call satellite framed. So prepositional phrase, for example, is kind of a add-on to the verb, a kind of satellite moving around it. And other languages express the path of the motion in the verb. So they're what they call verb framed languages. And this difference has then been studied in a number of languages, also in relation to gesture use. A good bit of this research has involved narrations of cartoons, for example. This goes back to the tradition that David McNeil started in his lab and working in psycholinguistics, then looking at how people narrated events that they saw in a cartoon and comparing this across different languages. And the cartoon he used was called Canary Row. So let's just look at a little excerpt of one scene from that, and we'll see how this was studied and analyzed in terms of narrators' gestures talking about this. Here's the scene.
Now what do you pose that putty cat up to now?
So we want to focus on this tragic event for the cat, where the cat's trying to get the bird, but then the following happens. So he was not very successful. So this has been researched in different ways, where then looking at how people narrated this movement that the cat made going from one building to another. And using this distinction between satellite frame languages and verb frame languages, Kita and Özerek looked at English versus Japanese and Turkish. Turns out Japanese and Turkish are also verb framed languages. And looking at the gestures people used in narrating this part of the cartoon, they looked at what kind of gesture path did the speakers trace when they were talking about that, if they used a gesture. Did they make some kind of arc gesture, a curve? Did they make an arc gesture and also a straight line movement, like from one building to another? Or did they just make a straight line movement showing from one building to another and not show this kind of arcing path between the two? And what they found is that here, so the white would be the arc only gestures, that there was a strong preference for producing that kind of arc among the English speakers, Whereas in Japanese and Turkish, there was a more mixed kind of use of gestures, sometimes using these just the straight gesture, sometimes the arc and the straight, sometimes just an arc. So the question is then, why is there that difference? Well, it turns out in English, if we think of how you would talk about that event, you'd probably say the cat swung. So to swing, the cat swung from one building to another on the rope. English gives us that verb to talk about the path and the transfer in one word, whereas in the verb frame languages, you would have to say something like, went from one building to another by swinging, something like that. You'd have to add some other phrase to it. So their finding suggests that the speakers are coordinating their gestures to go with the typological structure of the language that they're speaking to describe these different spatial events that they saw. So we see a connection between the forms available in the language and how speakers are conceptualizing the event and then depicting that in some way. Let's turn to abstract concepts then. If we say, okay, it makes sense that we can use gesture to talk about physical, spatial events in the world. That's maybe more expected. What about when we talk about abstract ideas? And so here we see in gesture sometimes the expression of abstract ideas in terms of physical entities. Going back to David McNeil's paper in 1985, where he started laying out some of his basic principles in this article, So You Think Gestures Are Nonverbal, he introduced these different categories and said that gestures that express abstract ideas can be thought of as kinds of metaphors, actually. He discussed this further in his 1992 book on Hand and Mind. So what he focused on in particular was when speakers were narrating these cartoons, they might say something like, introducing it was a Sylvester and Tweety cartoon, that was what we just saw, and then raising their hands, and again, we see this kind of two hands open, facing each other in a distance that might be one which someone might use to hold something between their hands. This is what McNeil argued, that then it's as if the speaker is presenting an object that would be like maybe the genre of discourse, that it was a cartoon and presenting that to someone else. So he claimed that these are then metaphorical uses of gesture. And since then, there's been a good bit of research on other ways in which gestures express abstract concepts metaphorically. And one of the domains that has been looked at in some detail is time itself. How do people talk about time and events in time, and how do they gesture about them? In one study, Cooperrider and Nunez looked at, had the participants read a small story and then have to retell it to someone else. And the story was about, what if the entire history of the universe were compacted into one day? What would the different parts of the day represent? And so here the speaker is describing how the development of the galaxy would be just the first morning to the early afternoon, basically. So that would take up actually a good bit of time in that one day. And as she was saying that, then she moved her hands from being further apart to then moving the left one closer to the right one. So tracing a path through time from left to right to then depict this change over time, let's say. Interestingly, the speaker doesn't use any kind of spatial language there, is just the galaxy. So she doesn't say, from this to that, for example. Here's another example where a talk show host is talking about Stevie Wonder and him doing a concert, and that he's going to present all the songs in the album, Songs in the Key of Life, in this concert. And so let's see what he does when he says that.
But for his concert this year, he's doing, I think, from beginning to end, Songs in the Key of Life.
So from beginning to end, Songs in the Key of Life. So he then, with his index finger, traces this path again from left to right, repeats it in the two phrases, from beginning to end, Songs in the Key of Life, giving us this sense of the time as being some kind of movement through space. But interestingly, the speakers are using this lateral trajectory, and also going in a similar direction, left to right, which is if we think of timelines and how we often depict them, and at least in European cultures, then drawing them from left to right as well. So we see the spatialization of time, which has actually been researched in many different languages. So even in languages that are not as typically studied, like in Celtal, for example, native language in Mexico and some other areas in Central America, where then different spatial reference points are used. So there might actually be a geographically based time reference for uphill and downhill, for example, and that might be then gestured in a similar way. We also see reference to Chinese, for example, where then you have a vertical frame of reference that's sometimes used, and perhaps this might have to do with the writing system sometimes being writing the language in the vertical columns. But this has also been studied as a way in which past and future are then depicted along a vertical axis as opposed to the lateral axis. So a lot of research on time and gestures. Interestingly, again, because we don't necessarily have verbal expressions that go with that. So in English, we don't say, or in Russian and other European languages, we don't say something happened and it the earlier time was on the left and the later time was on the right, that we don't use left and right to then talk about temporal concepts, but still we use a spatial metaphor very commonly to talk about time. So this was discussed a bit more in the Metaphor and Gesture book in 2008, but there's been a lot of other research since then on these different kinds of metaphoric uses of gestures. So we see that if we take reference then not only to the physical world, but also to abstract ideas, we see that appearing in gesture in different ways, objectifying these abstract concepts. So these different points then help make an argument for why we might want to consider gesture in terms of our semantic analysis. Should it count as part of semantics? The challenge comes in if we then try to model this in some way theoretically and actually even in terms of concrete analysis. If we go back to de Saussure and his theory of the linguistic sign, talking about a concept, in this case like a tree, and you might have a word in your language, what he called a sound image, to refer to that concept, how these two are then bound together to each other. Lanneker, coming back to cognitive grammar, picked up on the same kind of idea, talking about as a semantic structure and a phonological structure to express the idea. The question then becomes, if phonological structure normally refers to elements of spoken language, can we extend that then to think of gesture as well? And a number of people have argued that, that we could do that. What Lanneker himself said is that grammatical structures may include both the full phonetic detail of an utterance, as well as any other kinds of signals, this idea of cues, again, signals, such as gestures and body language. Now, of course, most gesture researchers don't use the term body language, but this idea that movement in different ways that's visible could potentially be part of this so-called phonological structure. Lanneker tried to tease this apart a bit by saying, well, maybe we need to think of not just one structure and another structure, but kind of these channels of communication. So conceptualization channels, speech management, information structure, the objective situation you're talking about, and expression channels. So segmental content, which we can think of as the speech, the phonological elements, prosody, gesture going together. So this is a step towards figuring out how to make this model work and include gesture in some way. But there are a number of challenges. And so what I'd like to turn to now is the dynamic nature of spoken language and gesture and the challenges and the questions this raises for our semantic analysis. One of them is that we have different timescales that are involved simultaneously when we're using speech and gesture. There's the timescale of moment by moment expression, what we're doing when we're speaking words and producing gestures with them. There's the level of the phrase. So this might also go with the intonation unit, which is then a larger kind of construct, and gesture and speech are working together in some ways on that level. And there's also a level of larger chunks of discourse. We might think about it using the metaphor from the written language, the paragraph level, let's say, and the relation between speech and gesture on those levels. What we're going to see in a few examples here is that there's a multiple time scales working at once in this coordination of speech and gesture. And what I will conclude, and unfortunately not have a great answer for, is that we need to account for this somehow in our analysis, but I don't see an easy solution for this. We need maybe people working with dynamic systems theory and computational modeling to help us with this. So how can we make a more dynamic model of meaning? I'll show a few examples from this database, the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA Library Broadcast Newscape. And there are a number of scholars, here's some universities that they're from, who have been recording news broadcasts and recording them with the subtitles for the deaf and the hearing impaired to then have some way to search the video for what's being talked about and then also look at what's happening in those videos. And so this group is called the so-called Little Red Hen Lab. There's a whole story you can read on the website for why they call it that. But they're developing different tools for analyzing the video material to look at the connection between the speech and the gesture. So if we take this moment by moment level as words and gestures are produced, I'll take an example from, this is Kenneth Branagh, the actor, who's in an interview, and he's talking about what is it that allows you to make balanced judgments and decisions. Balanced, so maybe sort of well-considered or reasonable judgments and decisions. Let's just hear what he says here for a moment.
But on the inside, what is it that allows you to make balanced, if that's what you think there should be, judgments and decisions?
So we already see it's a bit of a complex utterance with this kind of parenthetical phrase in the middle that he's putting in there and a restart. And let's see what he does when he's saying that. So here's the same clip.
But on the inside, what is it that allows you to make balanced, if that's what you think there should be, judgments and decisions?
So just look at that one more time.
But on the inside, what is it that allows you to make balanced, if that's what you think there should be, judgments and decisions?
So we see his two hands, palms open, fingers slightly spread, moving up and down. He says something about balanced. This also relates to his restart. It's a complicated utterance in terms of the timing, because actually his hands start moving before he even says the first ba of balanced. So there's this complex temporal relation of, even with that word, the one single word balanced, and the representation of this in the gesture that he's using and repeating as he says that. So there's this moment by moment evolution of the utterance as he's producing it. This is, David McNeil has talked about this as having an idea, what he calls a growth point that develops and then unfolds and unfurls into speech and gesture. And you see this here, how the two parts, the speech and the gesture, interrelate with each other. And maybe the gesture even helps him coming up with the proper wording for this, that he has this idea that he wants to express. So that's already complex on the moment by moment level. But then we have, if we take a larger level, we saw this example talking about Stevie Wonder's album here. And if we think about that and look at it again, the gesture really goes with the phrases from beginning to end, songs in the key of life. Let's see that example here once again.
But for his concert this year, he's doing, I think, from beginning to end, songs in the key of life.
So we get a repetition of this index finger extended, tracing this path for those two phrases. So not only is the gesture going with the whole phrase, you need the phrase to make sense out of the gesture from beginning to end, this left to right movement, but even that phrase, the gesture unit gets repeated over the two verbal phrases. So there's then even an interrelation of timescales taking us to a larger timescale of a couple of phrases that go with the same almost the same gesture that gets repeated in these two times. Then if we take a bit of a larger unit, so let's take these discourse cohesive gestures, as McNeil called them, and he sometimes referred to them as catchments. It's a kind of unusual term again, but it's a kind of specific term that McNeil used to talk about these gestures that tie together different parts of the discourse. here's an example from an interview. This is on the Ellen show where Justin Timberlake is being interviewed, and he's talking about an awards show where they were presenting awards to the actors, and Ellen DeGeneres was also at that awards show with him as well. So he's talking with her about what happened in a particular moment. So let's hear what he says here. You can read along.
If you do, funny enough, I don't know if you still have that whole clip of you two introducing me, but if you'll notice, there was someone running behind you.
No, I didn't see that.
Well, obviously you didn't see it, right?
Yeah.
But one of the stagehands comes running up and says, "They want me to switch the batteries in your microphone."
So it was a strange situation where here Justin Timberlake is on stage, and an assistant, a stagehand, comes up to him very nervously and says, you know, they want me to switch the batteries in your microphone because batteries were running out and they didn't want to have a problem with the broadcast. So he's relating the story, and let's see what he does when he's telling the story.
If you do, funny enough, I don't know if you still have that whole clip of you two introducing me, but if you'll notice, there was someone running behind you.
No, I didn't see that.
Well, obviously you didn't see it, right?
Yeah.
But one of the stagehands comes running up and says, "They want me to switch the batteries in your microphone."
So what you might have noticed is this gesture that he starts using when talking about the clip, the film clip. And I'd like to come back to that. Here we see it again.
If you still have that whole clip of
I'll show it again.
If you still have that whole clip of
that whole clip of you, blah, blah, blah. And with this two hands, so in a sense, if we look at the form with the fingers extended, making a kind of, you know, rectangular shape or something like that. And if we go back to thinking about films in an old-fashioned way as really the film strip, you know, this kind of thing on a reel, where then a piece of it would be some kind of rectangular shape, could perhaps be an explanation for why the film clip is talked about in this way. But what we see is that he not only uses it when he talks about the word film clip, but he keeps coming back to this. Here he says it again.
No, I didn't see that.
Well, obviously.
And he doesn't even say anything there. He's just, you know, doing kind of word search, showing that same kind of gesture again, uses it once more.
But if you'll notice, there was some.
If you'll notice, somebody's coming back and then retelling the part of the story. And then at the end, you have the last one.
But one of the stagehands comes running up.
And again, just reintroducing part of the story. So what we see here is this repetition that in yellow, indicated here in yellow on the transcript, comes up even when he's not talking about a clip, but it recycles this idea that he introduced with the clip and with the gesture, bringing it back up throughout the discourse. And what McNeil says about these kinds of discourse cohesive gestures, what he calls a catchment, he says a catchment is recognized from recurrences of gesture form features over a stretch of discourse. Catchments are recognized from two or more gestures, not necessarily consecutive, with partially or fully recurring features of shape, movement, space, use of space, orientation, dynamics, etc. So they might have different ways in which they're repeated across the stretch of discourse. And here, this seems like a perfect example of that, where you see the same hand shape, the same orientation of the palms, in approximately the same space in front of them, being used over and over again, picking up this idea. So it ties the discourse together, in a sense, reminding perhaps the listener of what's being talked about in that moment. So we have this repetition on a bigger level, on a larger level, these catchments then bringing an idea back and referring to something, even if the referent isn't mentioned again verbally. So he didn't keep mentioning film clip, he just kept doing the gesture, and that was in a way enough to recall that idea over a stretch of discourse. So we have these different ways in which gesture is relating to the speech, and this is what I want to suggest or argue is a challenge then for our semantic analysis. How can we, if we want to include gesture in some way in our linguistic semantic analysis, how do we do that when there are these multiple timescales that are working together? How can we handle this adequately? I'll already tell you I don't have a good answer for this, but I think we need to think about a few aspects of it. going back to McNeil's work in his 2000 book on language and gesture, he discussed in more detail this idea of this kind of growth point of an idea. And he says each idea unit that we express in a conversation involves thinking in global imagery and linguistic categories simultaneously. So one of his points is that the idea you have might be some kind of image that you might mentally simulate, but you also have the restriction of the categories that are in the language you're speaking in the moment. So like we saw, there are verb frame languages and satellite frame languages. And depending on the language you're using, you have to frame your idea in the right way so that you can express it in that given language, given the lexical items and the grammatical structures that you have in that language. But the imagery might be some kind of holistic thing that you're trying to present. So the imagery then that might be appearing in gesture, we end up with a dialectic between the linguistic forms and the gestural forms. So he says there's a dialectic of these forms of thinking, the imagistic and the linguistic categories, going back and forth between each other gives rise to speech and gesture through their collaboration. So we see that one might influence the other. And actually you see that sometimes, like when someone is at a loss for words and they are looking at their gesture to kind of formulate the idea verbally, or sometimes when a speaker restarts their utterance and they also restart their gesture as well to express that idea, to keep them going together. So this idea that Slobin called thinking for speaking, thinking in a way that fits your language, might be reconceived as thinking for speaking and gesturing, given what McNeil said, that these two streams of information are going on at the same time. Interesting side note, we could even think about thinking for writing. This isn't talked about very much, but there is research on what's called keystroke logging. So when someone is typing, you can do an analysis and keep track of the timing of their hitting the different keys on the keyboard as they're typing different kinds of words. And so that might actually reveal something about this process of thinking for writing as well. So that's a kind of interesting side note. But if we take this idea of semantics as conceptualization, and if we admit that then only part of it makes it into language, like thinking about McNeil's dialectic, there's the imagery part and the linguistic part, other parts might appear in gesture, in facial expressions, etc., which then takes us back to Bloomfield's idea mentioned at the beginning, that we then see these responses to the idea that you have in some visible ways as well, like in gesture or facial expressions, that might serve as stimuli to the hearer for how to reconstruct that idea that the speaker had. So our model of the linguistic sign as some kind of this, these two parts then gets shaken up a bit when we start looking at gesture. If we take Lanneker's illustration of it, that's one way of starting to think about it. But if we realize that these semantic structures and the so-called phonological structures or the expression channels are dynamic in nature, then to make an adequate explanation of this, we need some kind of dynamic model to analyze spoken language and gesture in use. So if we look at these different semiotic systems that are involved in producing utterances, we have at least the lexicogrammatical system and intonation, which are inherently connected to the verbal production. And in some languages, we have lexical tones as well, like in Chinese, for example. And we look at them in connection with the gesture and facial expressions, then we can think of them as different parts of polysemiotic communication. So I draw on this term that Jordan Zlatev introduced with colleagues, that if we think about multiple semiotic systems working together, then communication is polysemiotic to varying degrees. Aliyah Morgenstern also uses the term plurisemiotic, so another way of thinking about that as well. Then if we think about that as this kind of puzzle with the different pieces that go together, and we go back to our model that we had here that Lanneker elaborated from Saussure, then we might say, well, maybe it should look more like this. You know, if we have our two sides, the conceptualization side and the expression side, each of them is a kind of puzzle of different parts going together. But in any moment of expression, certain parts are getting expressed, but maybe others not. So maybe some aspects of an idea are appearing in some ways in, spoken language and the verbalization and intonation, for example, and then others are appearing in another combination. So we might have intonation and gesture working together, or we might then look at these as holistic systems. In some contexts, we really focus on how we're expressing what we're expressing and really, make with conscious effort, produce our verbal utterance in a certain way with certain intonation and certain gestures, and really kind of focus on all of those together. And if we then look at this, complex interrelation, how are all of these combinations working together, then we start thinking on a higher level about how communication is working. We can move from language and gesture to this level of polysemiotic communication. That might be something we can accept in a certain way, but then if we think, how do we move that into a more dynamic way of thinking? And this is the challenge that remains. As I suggested, maybe we need to think about complex dynamic systems, and maybe scholars who are working in that area have some suggestions. But it seems to be, if we want to adequately account for how speech and gesture are working together, as we've seen, there are different time scales on which this is working, and then to try to put that together into a bigger picture, it's quite a complex scenario. So it's more of a question that I leave us with. How can we handle that if we accept that we need to think about this combination more seriously? And I will close with just an acknowledgement to the Russian Science Foundation for funding of the interpreters research, and mention that a little advertising here at the end, that I'll also be teaching an online course in January, which enrollment is open till December 1st, on analyzing forms, functions, and meanings of gesture. So a 1-week online course. The QR code takes you to the website there for that. And we also in Amsterdam have a master's program, a 1-year master's program on multimodal communication, which then includes attention to gesture as well, but also looking at metaphor, looking at text and image together, and news and advertising, for example. So I'll just mention that. Again, the QR code takes you to the website in case that's of interest. So I will leave it at that. Thanks very much, and be happy to answer any questions or hear comments that you might have.
Thank you. Thank you for this very interesting talk. Now it's time for the questions. They may be asked in English or in Russian, or as you prefer. So please, if there are any. Да, Юля.
Добрый день, большое спасибо, Алан. Кажется, здесь все говорят по-русски, да, Коля?
Я думаю, что да.
Да.
Хорошо. На самом деле у меня очень много вопросов, я буду их как-то по очереди, наверное, задавать.
Это всегда, когда мы разговариваем, это всегда возникает у вас много вопросов, да.
Значит, во-первых, у меня такое ощущение, что в последнее время исследования жестов больше сосредотачиваются на кейс-стадис, на исследовании каких-то отдельных случаев, отдельных способов проявления, больше, чем корпуса, проценты, соотношения, вероятность. Больше к качественным, да, исследованиям, чем количественным. Во-первых, насколько я права, во-вторых, насколько это имеет смысл для науки, и потому что, да, может как привычно думать, что если большинство таких-то значений передаются такими-то жестами, значит, мы можем говорить, что это значение связано с такими-то жестами. Но если мы нашли 1, 2, 3, 5 случаев, когда какой-то жест выражал какое-то значение, это интересно, но что это нам скажет о языке?
Да, здесь я рассказывал о некоторых примерах, просто чтобы передать принципы, то есть такие принципы, как можно думать о семантике, например. Но есть, я думаю, что, может быть, я дал, моя картинка, это немножко biased, это тоже только показывает одну сторону исследований, потому что есть много исследований. Я говорил о таких корпусах, вот это Red Hen и так далее. И есть некоторые группы, которые делают такие большие проекты, где исследуют много примеров. Вот, например, я думаю, Дженнифер Хиннелл в Канаде, она исследовала вид, глагольный вид, и в английском языке. То есть, если мы говорим о продолжении действия, то есть progressive aspect, или non-progressive aspect. И она исследовала очень много примеров из этого корпуса, чтобы найти такие тенденции и патроны и так далее. Так что это один пример. Но есть группа в Англии, то есть в университете, в Оксфордском университете, теперь у них такой центр мультимодальной коммуникации, и есть, ну, я думаю, что вы смотрите иногда такие лекции онлайн, то есть показывают иногда, есть иногда лекции о жестах тоже. То есть у них Питер Урих из Германии, он работает с ними, и он лингвист, корпусный лингвист, и он также хорошо владеет компьютерами и исследует такие с квантитативной точки зрения, исследует жесты тоже. Так что я думаю, что есть такие группы. Марк Тернер тоже, у него разные коллеги, которые исследуют корпуса. Но есть и экспериментальные исследования в лабораториях психологии, которые смотрят, делают количественные исследования. То есть это, я думаю, что это я, скорее всего, интересуюсь исследованиями о примерах, качественные исследования и так далее. Так что это мое предпочтение. Но я не пример всех исследователей жестов. Я думаю, что так можно сказать.
Спасибо.
И была другая часть этого вопроса, я не помню.
На самом деле подтекст этого вопроса был, что может быть качественное исследование эффективнее, осмысленнее, да, потому что они...
Я думаю, что это помогает знать, как феномен происходит. То есть, если мы смотрим качественно такие отношения во времени, например, как я сказал, когда человек говорил вот balancing и 2-3 раза делал той же жест, но отношения во времени с речью, это очень сложно, то, что он делал. То есть это может дать основу, чтобы делать дальнейшие исследования более интенсивно об этом вопросе. То есть я думаю, что это помогает нам найти, какие могут быть вопросы, и что можно исследовать именно. И тогда после этого можно делать, например, эксперименты и более подробно смотреть на детали.
Спасибо. Я попробую дать кому-то еще задать.
Да, есть еще, я так понял, что у Юли есть еще вопросы, но, может быть, коллеги, у кого-то еще есть.
Или в чате.
Да, пока не вижу. Если можно, я бы хотел просто уточнить еще, правильно ли я понял интерпретацию этого исследования про мультфильм, да, про эту параболу, по которой кот летит. Правильно ли я понимаю, что идея такая, что для англоязычных носителей наиболее характерно именно употребление вот этого жеста, потому что в целом в английском языке наиболее стандартный способ выразить это непосредственно в глаголе. Да, то есть потому что там говорят he swung from one building to another. Скорее, чем he went from one building to another by swinging. Да, но сейчас я хотел уточнить. но при этом они именно так и говорили, или они все равно показывают вот этот жест вне зависимости от того, как именно они по-английски оформляют свои.
Да, это второе. То есть они показывали движение таким образом, и я не знаю, я не помню, сколько раз они именно говорили swing, этот глагол, просто если мы просто считаем, сколько жестов и какие они, тогда больше всего употребляли вот такой жест таким путем, даже если не произносили вот этот глагол.
Да,
И поэтому они исследователи подтверждают, что это показывает, что англоязычные участники так думают об этом движении, и это не зависит, это не просто отражение значения слова, потому что иногда критикуют такие исследования и говорят, что но если как можно знать, что это не просто, что жест не просто отражает слова. И они говорят, что если даже они сказали the cat went from one building to another, и тогда делают такое движение, это помогает подтвердить, что это манера мышления, то есть как они думали об этом действии.
То есть траектория движения как бы более обязательна для выражения какого бы то ни было, вербального или невербального, чем в другом языке.
И что если в английском языке чаще всего мы говорим swing для такого движения, тогда, наверное, мы, скорее всего, думаем о движении таким образом, даже если не произносим такой глагол в данный момент. То есть это как патрон мышления, и мы... то есть дети, когда они осваивают этот язык в детстве, то есть они также осваивают такие, не знаю, визуальные или манеры мышления. Я не знаю, как это выразить. Да.
Да, понятно, спасибо.
Я думаю, что это интересно, потому что это может быть тоже... Некоторые говорят, что это культурный феномен, что это, то есть как мы воспринимаем мир и как мы это выражаем, это может быть часть культуры, то есть это не только слова в языке, но и satellite frame, verb frame, это как культурные модели, которые выражают, как мир работает и как действия, как события происходят в мире, может быть, таким образом.
Да, спасибо. Так, есть ли еще вопросы? Так, ну если давайте Юля тогда.
Да, спасибо. Еще я хотела узнать, что вы, Алан, думаете вот про что. В примере из Макмилла про It was a Sylvester and Trudy cartoon был границы жеста обозначены довольно приблизительно. Там, например, не показана фаза подготовки. Мы видим, что жест начался на was, но неизвестно, это подготовительная фаза была на was или уже stroke phase. С одной стороны. С другой стороны, я и Коля работали в проекте, где принципиально было до 0,01 секунды точность по времени. Вопрос в связи с этим. Как по-вашему, насколько и, может быть, в каких ситуациях может быть важна принципиально для понимания языка, понимания мышления, так, точность или наоборот, если мы просто поймем, что происходит с жестами, без привязки к 0,01 секунды, да, просто примерно на этих словах, на этой фразе.
Я понимаю, что здесь это такие скобки, это показывает stroke, размах жеста. Так что it was a Sylvester and Sweetie cartoon. Так что это это preparation, это, наверное, вот немножко до этого, was a Sylvester and Sweetie cartoon. Это, и какой был вопрос, я не помню.
А насколько важна, по-вашему, для понимания природы языка, природы мышления, точность вот, выявленных соответствий слова-жест? Насколько точно мы нашли, на каком слоге, на каком звуке появился жест? Важно ли это нам знать, чтобы, там, как бы, что это может нам показать? В каких случаях это может быть неважно?
То есть важно ли для понимания высказывания или...
Понимание высказывания, понимание мышления,
Ага.
mental imagery, everything.
Я думаю, что если мы хотим вот анализировать, что зритель понимал, тогда это я не знаю об исследованиях, которые смотрят точно на время и были ли разницы в том, как кто-то понимал что-то в отношении к тому, когда именно появился жест или нет. Я не знаю о таких исследованиях. Может быть, есть. Но я... Да?
Я просто встречала когда-то давно, вроде бы на рубеже 90-х и нулевых было исследование про то, что 500 миллисекунд, смещение жеста на 500 миллисекунд по отношению к звуку уже воспринимается как что-то противоестественное. Но 500 миллисекунд – это довольно много.
И если мы хотим анализировать, как человек думает, когда жестикулирует, тогда, да, я думаю, что это, то есть исследование времени, это тоже очень важный элемент таких исследований. Это можно узнать другие детали без не глядя на то, когда что произошло. Но я думаю, что это дает еще важную информацию, если мы смотрим, когда именно точно что-то, когда производили жест и речь. Это не мое исследование, но я думаю, что это важно.
Может быть, у вас есть идеи, какая информация может быть получена из того, что жест появился на each was, а не на each was?
Не совсем понимал. То есть, еще раз?
We can see the start of the gesture on the word each was a Sylvester and Sweetie cartoon. But if the gesture had appeared on each was the cartoon, why each can make difference and where can be the difference?
Я думаю, что это относится также к структуре информации, то есть и какая информация новая и что уже известно. Потому что если я стараюсь думать о примере, но если кто-то делает движение с усилием, например, иногда, по-моему, это показывает, что это для них более важная информация, то, что они показывают. So I'll say this in English. So, like, if I say, it was a Sylvester and Tweety cartoon. What did you see? What kind of cartoon did you see? Well, it was a Sylvester. That quickly, I'm guessing they wouldn't. So you have to see actually what people do. But I'm guessing that it would be unlikely that someone would go, it was a Sylvester and Tweety cartoon. That's very strange, to do, and then delayed, and then speech. That's very unnatural. So what that means cognitively, I don't know. But if someone does this gesture suddenly, at the beginning of the utterance, it suggests to me that they're highlighting something about that information at an earlier point than if they said it was a Sylvester and Tweety cartoon. If the timing is a little bit slower and the timing goes more with the actual utterance about which kind of cartoon, Sylvester and Tweety cartoon, that suggests to me it's more neutral. This is just my theorizing in the moment. I don't have a lot of basis for this, but I do know that there's research on, like Cornelia Muller's work on the highlighting of information in gesture, whether it's made with a bigger gesture, whether it's made with a quicker movement, or whether it's made with a more tense hand shape, or, this kind of highlighting of information. There is a difference between how the gesture is produced when there is more effort involved than when it's a more relaxed gesture. So the more effortful kind of production seems to go with highlighting information, which you also see them prosodically, possibly being emphasized, as opposed to the more relaxed gesture being to express some idea that's maybe also done with less effort for the speech production, So it seems to be a mismatch if someone says something with, great emphasis, stressing the syllables, and they're producing really small, relaxed gestures. There's a mismatch there, in terms of just my intuition of how people speak, as opposed to, emphasizing in speech and emphasizing with bigger gestures, with clearer stroke movements. I think, I don't know if that's been researched empirically in terms of this lining up of manner of gesture production and manner of speech production, but that's intuitively, that seems to be, there's a kind of match.
Thank you. It does make sense. And at the same time, I can think of an example when someone starts gesturing before pronouncing their corresponding words. Like there was an example with an elder man describing a boy from the Pierre Stories film taking up his trousers, and the man started gesturing before he could say what happened actually in the scene. So it was like the boy had some ache in his leg, and then the man described the real reason of this movement, like putting the boy's trousers up. So what do you think of these cases?
So that kind of example makes me think of what McNeill talks about in terms of this growth point of an idea. That you have an idea, you're going to talk about why was somebody pulled their pants up or whatever, and then but you need to find the right words for that, or the right way to express it. But the spatial imagery can already immediately be enacted, especially it's an action that was done with the hands. So it's easy to then show it, so unlike the dinosaur example, where I showed that, your hands then become dinosaur jaws. This is not something you do too often, but if you talk about opening something or, manipulating an object that you do with your hands, it's so like, I go back to the thing I mentioned, the idea from Hofstadter and Alibali about the gesture as simulated action. That's their idea, that if we have a mental simulation of some process and it's something that we can do with our hands, and we have a rich image of it that's being used in the moment, it's easier to gesture about that than it is if you have a complex idea that doesn't lend itself to thinking about how do we physically interact with that thing, So there's a kind of lower threshold when you're talking about a physical action you do with your hands. It makes it easier, it facilitates gesturing, as opposed to talking about something you would not do with your hands. So in this case, it seems like it suggests the speaker already was mentally simulating that action and then just needed to find the right words to express it.
Thank you a lot. Коля, я не хочу занимать все время на
Да, я
себя.
понимаю. Да, коллеги, если у кого-то есть вопросы, то не пугайтесь. Действительно, может быть, разная степень привычки работать с таким материалом и разная степень
для начинающих,
да, заинтересованности. Поэтому не надо думать, что приветствуются только вопросы от специалистов в изучении жестов. Это не так. Да? В каком смысле даже, может быть, наоборот.
Но
У
если...
меня, возможно, есть вопрос.
Да, пожалуйста.
У меня просто была похожая тема в дипломе, и как раз мне надо было семантически соотносить жесты с кусочками речи. Вот. И вопрос вот про человека, который про кусок фильма говорил и показывал такие буковки L пальцами. Он несколько раз к этому возвращался, и в одном случае мы можем это соотнести с каким-то вот прям про кусочек фильма со словами, грубо говоря, соотнести, а потом он как бы несколько фраз порождает. Мы этот жест к чему бы скорее отнесли? Вот именно скорее по времени или как это объяснять семантически, и с чем это соотносить в речи? Именно те жесты, которые потом происходят, где уже нету никакого коррелята в речи, вот, но жест есть.
Да, я думаю, что это дает нам проблему для семантического анализа, как они относятся друг к другу. И вот именно я привел такой пример, чтобы сказать, что это именно если мы хотим думать о семантике и включать жесты, тогда надо думать о таких вопросах. Я думаю, в этом контексте он это показывает, что данные, он возвращается к этой теме, он показывает вот 4 раза делает такой жест, это показывает, что я говорю об этом и показывает это. То есть если это как будто напоминает слушателю, что речь идет об этом клипе, ролике. И мне я это понимаю, что как будто есть, если бы он не делал такой жест, можно понимать вообще, о чем он говорил, но я думаю, что это дает как будто второй слой значения. И это когда мы слушаем радио или слушаем видео без видео, подкаст или что-то, вообще понимаем, о чем говорят, но получаем больше информации, если мы видим говорящего. Я думаю, что самое важное. Это и здесь мы понимаем вообще его рассказ, но если мы видим, что он делает, тогда есть дополнительная информация. И вот для меня это вопрос для семантики, то есть как анализировать высказывание, как делать семантический анализ, если иногда есть такая дополнительная информация, и иногда мы это воспринимаем, и иногда нет. То же самое, как если бы он делал такие жесты, и Эллен Дедженерес не смотрела на него. Может быть, она смотрела на что-то другое. Может быть, она не видела такие жесты. Тогда она не получала бы тогда такую информацию. И для меня это интересный вопрос. Я хочу больше писать об этом, потому что я думаю, что сначала нужны такие теоретические основы, чтобы думать об этом. То есть язык или коммуникация вообще как феномен с разными слоями, и тоже, которые не каждый слой имеет также, не каждый слой также важен в каждом моменте. То есть это динамическая система, и это пока сложно описывать, и я думаю, что если у нас такие теоретические основы, и тогда, может быть, моделирование компьютером, тогда можно лучше анализировать такие моменты и вообще коммуникацию как мультимодальную, полимодальную и мультиканальную и так далее. Это ответ на вопрос или нет? Я не знаю.
В целом, да, это важно.
меня сейчас есть комментарий по поводу этого же примера. Мне кажется, ну, это опять-таки, естественно, тоже совершенно интуитивное ощущение у меня возникло, когда я смотрел этот фрагмент, что тут еще существенно, ну, некоторые особенности этой коммуникации, которые они реализуют, там, ну, там все время и гости, и ведущие, они все время пытаются как можно больше пошутить, и с этим связано то, что часто нелегко некоторую общую тему разговора держать. Она все время уплывает. Вот что-то рассказываешь, а при этом появляется какая-то одна шутка, другая шутка, они обмениваются какими-то там панчами. И, возможно, вот то, что он постоянно возвращается, вот этот жест в процессе разговора, это такой способ как бы не потерять полностью вот эту тему обсуждения, потому что она все время куда-то уходит за такими пикировкой такой.
Да, я согласен, потому что тоже был такой, как будто, не знаю, шутка, что она не заметила, что произошло за ней, тогда это, да, возвращает нас. Вот я об этом говорю. И есть еще другой элемент, что это то есть камера, то есть показывают разговор по телевизору, и тогда тоже они, ну, как актеры, я думаю, что вообще они живые, активно говорят и показывают, и действуют, и это обычно для них, они привыкли к этому. Так что это не тихий человек, который стесняется, и это другой характер человека, что они обычно жестикулируют, наверное, больше, может быть, чем других. Так что это есть разные факторы, почему они так говорят и жестикулируют. Юлия. Я вижу, что думаете.
Большое спасибо, Алан. Да, по крайней мере, один вопрос еще я бы хотела задать. Вы говорили о verb-framed, satellite-framed languages и о том, что мы видим в жестах различия. Или вы говорили о том, как в разных языках устроены метафоры для времени, справа налево или снизу вверх, слева направо, да? Снизу вверх, сверху вниз. Может быть, это, опять-таки, slang across the street, может быть, это все-таки маргинальное различие, редкое различие, и оно не позволяет нам говорить о системных различиях в способе осмысления мира или вот о системных различиях в языках.
Если говорим о swing across, это отдельный пример. Но если говорим о времени и о событиях, то есть видим такие жесты, то есть слева направо, очень часто. И это не зависит от, если даже не говорим о времени, а просто говорим о процессе, что произошло, рассказываем. Поэтому я думаю, что это как мы понимаем время и как мы жестикулируем о времени и как вообще жестикулируем о событиях во времени, тогда это основная идея. Тогда, если говорим о как мы понимаем мир, и я думаю, что это тогда более важно, чем как мы описываем данную отдельную ситуацию с странными движениями, например. А если вот такие патроны слева направо или сверху вниз, так часто бывают, что это, когда это так часто повторяется, это, по-моему, это как будто recurrent gesture, но другого сорта. То есть это не recurrent gesture прагматический жест, а recurrent патрон моделирования действия или что-то. И думаю, что это важно, что мы показываем очень часто действия в одну сторону, а не как круг, например, или... И если смотрим на язык, если, как в английском, если говорим, что это before and after, or going to do something, all of these things in the future, being ahead, это тоже, это интересно, что мы реже жестикулируем вперед и назад. Иногда мы так делаем, но это Куперайдер и Нуньес, вот эта статья, они they argue, что это основной принцип, как мы думаем, как мы понимаем такие действия слева направо. И они говорят, что это частично связано с тем, как мы пишем. То есть, если мы пишем слева направо, то есть если смотрим на иврит или арабский язык, и есть исследования, что говорящие этих языков жестикулируют по-другому, что это не совсем справа налево, но это смесь разных движений, когда жестикулируют о событиях. То есть это может быть тогда связано с тем, как мы пишем, но не только. Это тоже, если говорим о математике, показываем прошедшее, будущее, так часто слева направо. Это культурная модель осмысления мира.
Большое спасибо.
Спасибо. Так, да, коллеги, ну, наверное, я думаю, что нам уже в наше время подходит к концу. Если есть еще какие-то вопросы, то, наверное, может быть, на один у нас еще есть время. А если нет, тогда поблагодарим еще раз Алана за очень интересный доклад, в котором действительно очень много вопросов остается. Что, собственно, и было целью этого выступления. На этом мы сегодняшнее наше заседание заканчиваем. И, надеюсь, до следующих встреч. Следите за объявлениями.
И, может быть, в чате я напишу мой email, то есть, если есть вопросы, тогда можно таким образом и задавать такие вопросы. Рад буду письменно отвечать также.
Все, да, тогда всем спасибо.
Окей.
Спасибо.